Before we begin, I must warn you. What you are about to hear is not a story of comfort, but a revelation that may haunt you. These are not myths, not distant fables, but the forbidden truths Carl Jung uncovered about the human soul. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. If you dare step into the abyss with me, stay until the end, because only then will you understand why the brightest light can hide the darkest monster. Now, listen carefully. The first thing you must understand is that goodness, when exaggerated beyond the natural balance of the psyche, is not a virtue, but a mask for horror. Imagine this. Every day, countless people present themselves as saints, smiling, sacrificing, offering bottomless. But beneath that radiant mask, a fracture deepened. It is not visible to the untrained eye, yet it grows like a hairline crack in a mirror, spreading silently until the glass finally shatters. Studies today tell us that those who repress aggression in the name of virtue are statistically more likely to explode in sudden acts of cruelty. This is not mere coincidence. It is the law of shadow. What is denied in consciousness not vanish. It lurks, waiting. In my work, I once observed a patient whose life was a parade of selflessness. She gave to everyone, her husband, her children, her church, her community. Her house smelled of polished wood and freshly baked bread, every corner a monument to warmth and order. Her voice was soft, her eyes kind. But when she sat across from me, silence spoke louder than her words. Behind her careful smiles lived a ferocity she could not name. It seeped into her dreams. Wolves ripping through her living room, shadows strangling her children, fires consuming her neatly folded linens. These dreams were not random. They were revelations of the shadow she had caged. Her monstrous rage, ignored for decades, had grown teeth. Modern neuroscience affirms what my clinical intuition suggested. The prefrontal cortex, when forced into constant inhibition of instinctual anger, eventually falters. The amygdala, ancient and primal, erupts with unprocessed fury. Society calls a sudden snap is, in truth, the inevitable consequence of repression. The brain is not a it is a furnace. Suppress the flame too long and you ignite an explosion. This is why psychologists at Stanford and Yale speak today of the empathy paradox, the phenomenon in which those most consumed by the need to be good are at highest risk of moral collapse. But this insight is not modern alone. The ancients whispered of it. In Christian theology, Lucifer himself was once a creature of pure light. His fall was not born from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of perfection. In Buddhist teachings, the middle way warns against extremes, even in virtue. To lean too far into saintliness is as dangerous as surrendering to vice. And in Greek myth, the story of Narcissus teaches that self-adoration of one's purity leads to death by drowning in one's own. These are not myths. They are encrypted warnings. The signs of such a dangerous transformation are subtle. Watch the woman who never raises her voice. Her silence grows heavier than a scream. Watch the man who forgives too quickly. His forgiveness curdles into hidden resentment. Watch the child who never says no. Their obedience will one day burst forth as vengeance. Each of these scenes is suspense disguised as kindness. If you listen carefully, you will hear the ticking of a cycle. The stages of this phenomenon move like a storm. First comes repression, the relentless silencing of anger, jealousy, then accumulation, layer upon layer of denied emotion pressed into the unconscious. Next, distortion. Reality itself begins to bend, and the person convinces themselves they are good, holy, untouchable. Finally, eruption. The shadow seizes control, and the good soul becomes the monster they never imagined they could be. This cycle is inevitable unless awareness intervenes. When such possession expands beyond the individual, entire societies fall. History is filled with examples, revolutions fueled not by cruelty alone, but by idealists who believed their virtue justified rivers of blood. The French Revolution began with cries for liberty and ended with the guillotine. The Inquisition claimed holiness while burning innocents alive. Collective goodness, untempered by shadow, breeds collective monstrosity. It is not evil in its obvious form that must fear, but the smiling crowd that believes it is righteous. There is, however, a protocol of survival, Consciousness must become the shield. One must stare into the mirror and name the rage, the envy, the desire to harm. Not indulge it blindly, but acknowledge it fully. To draw a limit immediately when manipulation disguises itself as kindness. To retreat strategically when a relationship suffocates you with endless demands of sacrifice. The task is not to be only good, but to be whole, to hold light and shadow in balance. And so, let me leave you with this. Goodness without shadow, not human. It is a mask stretched thin over an abyss. If you trust only the smile, you will never see the fangs hiding underneath. To survive, you must dare to look into the darkness within yourself before it devours you from the inside out. For every angel that refuses to see its own demon is already halfway to becoming one. There is a particular silence that surrounds those who sacrifice too much. It is not the peace of contentment, but the suffocating hush of a soul that is slowly bleeding itself out. Consider this image. A man who smiles as he hands over his last coin, his last ounce of strength, his last fragment of dignity. He calls it love, devotion, morality. But behind that smile, his eyes are hollow. His voice carries no resonance. What appears noble is, in truth, a slow self-immolation. Statistics today reveal that chronic self-neglect, those who consistently prioritize others at the expense of their own needs, correlates with higher risks of depression, dissociation, and sudden violent breakdowns. Sacrifice without boundary becomes not virtue, but poison. I recall a patient whose entire existence was defined by the word for others. She gave herself to her family, her workplace, her religious community. Her hands were always busy, her feet always moving. If one entered her kitchen, the air was heavy with spices, warmth, and endless offerings. Yet when she sat in the small chair across from me, her fingers trembled, her smile was rehearsed, and in the spaces between her words, there was the metallic taste of... She never admitted it outright, but it lived in her tone, in the way she exhaled after every sentence. Her unconscious dreams revealed it more vividly. Scenes of drowning, of her body sinking into black water, while others floated to safety. In those dreams, her sacrifice was no longer beautiful. It was a noose tightening around her throat. Contemporary psychology has given this condition a name: pathological altruism, a term that describes those who destroy themselves through the obsessive need to help, to save, to fix. Researchers at Berkeley and Cambridge have found that when the brain's reward systems become wired to self-sacrifice, the person loses the capacity to regulate resentment and aggression. The altruism turns cannibalistic, and when it finally collapses, it does not manifest as gentle exhaustion. It erupts as monstrous rage, the kind that shocks families, the kind that leaves neighbors whispering, "How could someone so good do something so terrible?" But long before universities studied it, ancient wisdom warned us. In Christian parables, the figure of Martha endlessly serves. Yet it is Mary who pauses, who listens, who claims her space, who is praised. In Buddhism, the concept of the bodhisattva is not blind sacrifice, but enlightened compassion, balanced with wisdom. In the Greek tragedies, the hero who gives without measure is always doomed to ruin, swallowed by fate because he believed himself too pure. Even the Norse myths whisper the same truth. Odin gives his for wisdom, but in doing so, he acknowledges true sacrifice requires awareness. The warning signs creep in quietly. The caregiver who never says, "I am tired," but whose laughter grows brittle. The spouse who hides every disappointment behind indulgent smiles, but whose hands clench under the table. The leader who forgives betrayal after betrayal, yet whose nights are haunted by images of revenge. Each is a scene of suspense, the silence before the storm, the smile before the scream. And always, those around them feel something, though they cannot name it. The way the air thickens in their presence, the way conversations feel heavier, as if an invisible weight hangs in the room. The stages of this descent are predictable. First, the sacrifice is chosen willingly. It feels noble, intoxicating, even holy. Second, the sacrifice becomes routine. What was once a gift turns into a duty, repeated until the giver no longer feels choice. Third, resentment builds. The unconscious begins to crafting dreams of a fantasy. The carefully maintained image of goodness collapses, and the hidden monster steps into the light. This is the architecture of transfer. The saint predator, not because of inherent evil, but because of endless repression. When magnified across a community, the consequences are catastrophic. Entire religious orders, nations, or political movements have cloaked themselves in the mantle of sacrifice for the people, for the future, for God. And yet history shows what follows. The self-sacrificial zealots turn inquisitors, revolutionaries turn executioners, saviors turn tyrants. The collective mask of sacrifice conceals oceans of blood. It is the psychology of possession. A group convinced of its unending goodness will justify atrocity no single individual could bear to name. Survival requires a brutal honesty. You must ask yourself, when does your sacrifice stop serving love and start serving your ego's need to appear holy? Consciousness is the only antidote. To look into the mirror and admit, I resent you, I am tired, I want to scream. These admissions are not sins, they are lifelines. They prevent the shadow from seizing total control. The strategy is simple, but hard. Draw the line immediately, retreat strategically, reclaim your right to selfhood. Without it, you will drown in the very water you poured for others. Remember this, a smile can hide a suffocating scream. A gift can carry venom. And the one who gives endlessly may one day demand repayment with unimaginable violence. To walk blindly into such sacrifice is to step into the jaws of a beast disguised as virtue. The only escape is balance, awareness of the shadow, reverence for limits, and the courage to say no. For in the end, sacrifice without self is not love. It is a slow transformation into a monster you will no longer recognize. There is a truth too terrifying for most to accept. The brighter the light a person shows the world, the darker the shadow they. Imagine walking into a cathedral at dusk. The stained glass windows blaze with colors of holiness. Behind the altar there is a corner where the light cannot reach. Dust gathers there. Rats move inside. The faithful never look. So too is the psyche of the excessively virtuous human being. The more radiant the image of purity, the more repressed and festering the darkness behind it. I once sat across from a man whose reputation in his community was flawless. He volunteered at hospitals, donated to schools, forgave debts, and offered his home to strangers in need. To everyone around him, he was the embodiment of. His handshake was warm, his voice steady, his eyes calm. Yet, in his dreams, another story. He confessed visions of choking his wife, of pushing strangers under trains, of burning his church to the ground. He wept in my office as though confessing sins he could not understand. But these were not sins, they were messages. His unconscious was screaming for him to face the shadow he had buried beneath his crown of virtue. Neuroscience now lends clarity to this paradox. Functional MRI studies reveal that individuals who overactivate the brain regions associated with empathy and moral reasoning also show heightened activity in the limbic system when confronted with stress or betrayal. It is as though the more one strives to be good, the more volatile the suppressed becomes. Harvard researchers call this the empathy trap, where those addicted to moral superiority unconsciously build a monster that waits for the moment of. What Jung named the shadow, science now measures in blood flow and synaptic activity, yet long before machines traced brain patterns, human cultures knew. The Christian mystics spoke of the danger of pride and humility, where the pious become intoxicated by their own selfless. In Taoist wisdom, the yin and yang symbol warns us pure white always carries a black seed within it. In the myth of Pandora, the box contained both gifts and curses. To deny one is to unleash the other. Even in Hindu cosmology, the god Vishnu, protector and preserver, takes the form of Narasimha, a half-lion, half-man, who tears his enemies apart. The divine protector also bears monstrous claws. Virtue without shadow is a lie. Virtue with shadow integrated is truth. The warning signs are chilling if you learn to see them. The philanthropist whose smile lingers too long, whose eyes harden when gratitude is not expressed. The mother who insists on perfection in her children, her kindness edged with silent threat. the priest whose sermons glow with love, but whose voice shakes when he speaks of sinners. These are not random quirks. They are cracks in the mask. They are whispers from the shadow. And like a suspense film, the tension builds. The longer the mask is maintained, the more violent its eventual fall. The stages unfold with grim predictability. At first, virtue feels intoxicating, almost divine. The person becomes addicted to their own image of purity. Then comes denial. They see their anger, envy, or lust, but dismiss it as beneath them. Next, projection. They begin to see those forbidden traits in others, condemning neighbors, children, or entire groups as sinful. Finally, possession. The shadow bursts forth, and the one who preached love becomes an agent of cruelty. What shocks the world as hypocrisy is, in truth, the natural consequence of imbalance. When multiplied across societies, the results are catastrophic. Consider the Salem witch trials. Young girls who could not admit their own desires accused others, and soon an entire town was consumed by shadow masked as righteousness. Or the genocides of the 20th century, where leaders promised purity of race, nation, or ideology, and in the name of virtue, slaughtered millions. These are not aberrations. They are the collective shadow made flesh. The brighter the banner of goodness, the darker the crimes it conceals. The only defense is consciousness. One must dare to look into the abyss of one's own envy, cruelty, lust, and rage, to name it, to own it. Without this, the shadow rules from below. The protocol is survival through balance, immediate recognition of projection, retreat from the intoxication of moral superiority, and the cultivation of honest humility. To admit, I am capable of hatred, is not to embrace evil. It is to disarm it before it acts in secret. Here is the truth you must carry. The one who claims to be only good is already deceiving you. A smile without shadow is a lie. A soul that denies its own capacity for darkness is the most dangerous creature of all, for it will not see the monster coming when it rises from within, and it always rises. There is a form of prison that does not require bars or chains. It is built with smiles, generosity, and endless words of praise. Those who live inside it are not criminals, but saints, at least in appearance. They are the ones who never say no, who bend under every demand, who present themselves as immaculate examples of compassion. Yet beneath this gilded cage of goodness, something darker ferments. The soul suffocates not under cruelty, but under its own perfection. I once treated a young man whose reputation was so spotless that even his enemies admired him. He studied diligently, volunteered at shelters, donated most of his salary, and visited his sick mother every evening. His voice was calm, yet his dreams betrayed him. Night after night, he dreamt of standing on roofs, pushing strangers. He told me, with eyes wide and trembling, that during arguments he sometimes fantasized about slashing his own brother's throat. He hated himself for these thoughts. He prayed harder, gave more, smiled wider. But repression only sharpened the blade hidden in his unconscious. His cage of goodness became a crucible in which his shadow grew hotter and more violent. Modern research validates what I saw in him. Studies at MIT and Oxford reveal that chronic suppression of aggressive impulse does not eliminate them, strengthens. The brain stores them like compressed gas, and the more one resists, the more explosive the eventual release. What we call a psychotic break, a sudden snap, is often decades in the making, a detonation of everything denied. Neuroscientists describe this as the paradox of inhibition. The circuits designed to control emotion, when overused, collapse under their own pressure. This collapse does not bring peace. It brings monsters, yet the ancients already knew. The Stoics spoke of the danger of overvirtue, of building a life too rigid to allow the chaos of human emotion. The Bible tells us of Saul, a king anointed by God, whose outward piety gave way to murderous jealousy. In Greek myth, Pentheus forbade the Dionysian rites, suppressing all ecstasy and instinct, until he was torn apart by the very forces he denied. The message is universal. A cage of goodness eventually transforms into a theater of horror. The signs emerge gradually, shadows lengthening at dusk. Watch the parent who insists on flawless obedience, yet trembles with rage behind closed doors. Watch the teacher who smiles endlessly, but whose eyes harden when a student fails to show gratitude. Watch the neighbor who brings gifts every holiday, but whose silence afterward feels colder than ice. These are not accidents. They are cracks in the mask of virtue, glimpses of the monster waiting inside. The process follows a grim sequence. First, self-denial. The person rejects all anger, lust, envy, and selfish. Second, idealization. They construct a glowing image of themselves as pure, saintly, above the flaws of ordinary mortals. Third, resentment. The unconscious rebels, whispering dreams of violence, fantasies of revenge. Fourth, eruption. The cage shatters, and what bursts forth is not a balanced human, but a creature intoxicated with rage. The good man becomes unrecognizable, the good woman terrifying, the good child monstrous. This does not stop at the individual. Families can become cages of goodness. Communities can disguise control as kindness, strangling individuality under the weight of collective purity. Nations can intoxicate themselves with their own image of moral superiority, until, like a fever breaking, they descend into unspeakable cruelty. History records it again and again. Movements that begin with banners of light end with massacres in darkness. What then is the survival strategy? It is the courage to shatter before it collapses. To admit, I am not only good, I am capable of hatred, of envy, of selfishness. These admissions are not confessions of sin. They are acts of liberation. To draw boundaries immediately when goodness becomes suffocating. To retreat strategically from those who weaponize kindness to control. To remember always that consciousness shield, honesty. Here is the truth no one wants to hear. The most dangerous monster is not the obvious villain, but the saint who never allows himself to. For when his cage finally breaks, he will not know how to control the beast that emerges. To trust in the mask of endless goodness is to walk willingly into a trap. The only safety lies in balance. To honor both light and shadow, to recognize the claws beneath the smile, to remain awake while others sleep in the dream of purity. Goodness without shadow is not good. It is captivity, and captivity, no matter how radiant, always ends in violence. There is a moment when the saint's halo begins to burn. What once shone as pure light becomes a ring of fire, and the person who was worshipped for their endless kindness begins to unravel. The fall is not sudden. It is a slow, dreadful descent, like watching a statue crack under invisible pressure. The air grows tense around them, as if the atmosphere itself senses what is coming. And when the collapse finally arrives, it shocks everyone, though in truth, it was inevitable. I once treated a woman who was praised in her community as an angel. She raised abandoned children, cared for the dying, and offered her home to anyone in need. People said she had no enemies, but in her dreams she was a beast. She dreamt of tearing flesh with her teeth, of screaming curses in a language she did not know. One day, in waking life, she slapped a child so hard it left a mark. She fell to her knees afterward, weeping, begging forgiveness, terrified of herself. But it did not stop there. The more she tried to silence her rage with acts of love, the more violent her outbursts became. Eventually, her community no longer called her angel. They called her unstable. What they did not see was that her fall was not madness, but the shadow demanding its rightful place. Neuroscience explains this transformation. Chronic repression of aggression, combined with hyperactivation of moral self-image, leads to what psychologists now call ego fragility collapse. The individual becomes so identified with their saintly mask that any eruption of shadow threatens their very sense of existence. The brain reacts violently, swinging from extreme inhibition to extreme aggression. Researchers at Yale describe it as the pendulum effect. The further one pulls away from shadow, the more forcefully it returns. What Jung named the shadow, modern science confirms as neurobiological backlash, but the ancients also told this story. In Christian tradition, the Pharisees prided themselves on righteousness, yet became agents of cruelty against those who defied their law. In Buddhism, too much attachment to purity is warned against as a subtle form of pride. In Greek myth, Hippolytus devoted himself to chastity, scorning all desire, and was destroyed by the very passions he denied. Again and again, the message is whispered. The saint who refuses his shadow becomes its slave. The warning signs appear like cracks in porcelain. The person who insists too loudly on their goodness begins to show irritability in private. The helper who never accepts help grows strangely bitter when others succeed. The community leader whose sermons are drenched in compassion starts condemning small flaws with venom. Each is a scene from a psychological thriller. The smile falters, the voice trembles, the eyes reveal something unspoken. And those who are near sense it. The goodness feels too polished, too rehearsed, like an actor clinging to a role he no longer believes in. The stages of descent move in sequence. First, the intoxication of goodness, the joy of being admired as. Second, the pressure of denial, every dark impulse shoved deeper into silence. Third, distortion of reality. They project their shadow onto others, calling them evil, unworthy, sinful. Fourth, the eruption. The saint becomes the monster, and the crowd gasps as though they had never seen it coming. But the descent was written long before the fall. When this descent is mirrored collectively, entire nations consider the utopian movements of the past century. They promised equality, justice, paradise on earth. But when their leaders denied the natural shadow of power, greed, envy, aggression, they birthed dictatorships that devoured millions. The Soviet gulags, the Cultural Revolution, genocides justified in the name of purity. All are examples of the saint's descent on a national scale. What begins as a dream of goodness ends in rivers of blood. Survival requires brutal honesty. To protect yourself, you must see the descent before it reaches eruption. You must notice the saint whose kindness feels suffocating, the leader whose purity leaves no room for doubt, the friend who never expresses anger, but whose silence grows toxic. To defend yourself, you must name what they cannot. You are hiding your shadow. To retreat when necessary, to draw immediate limits, to protect your psyche like a fortress. Consciousness is not optional. It is the only weapon. The terrifying truth is this: the saint is not immune to monstrosity. In fact, they are the most vulnerable to it. The descent of the saint is more dangerous than the violence of the obvious criminal, because no one expects it, no one prepares for it, no one believes it until it is too late. The halo burns, the mask shatters, and what emerges is not a demon from outside, but the monster they created inside themselves. Goodness is not safe. Goodness, when absolute, is peril. Only balance, the union of light and shadow, protects the soul. Without it, even angels will, and when they do, their descent shakes the ground beneath everyone who believed in their life. Every transformation in monstrosity, it is not random, it is a sequence as predictable as the unfolding. To believe that will simply snap is to blind oneself. Silent stages that lead them there. In my work, I have seen this descent repeated countless. The good man, the devoted mother, the generous leader, all slowly overtaken by something darker. It is possession, but not by demons from the outside. It is possession by the shadow they refuse. The first stage is denial. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. The individual notices anger, but dismisses it, feels envy, but calls it unworthy, senses desire, but pushes it into silence. This denial is often praised by society. The man who never complains is admired. The woman who never shows rage is called virtuous. Yet denial is not purity. It is the first crack in the foundation. The unconscious remembers what the conscious mind tries to erase. The second stage is what cannot be admitted within begins to be seen everywhere out. The altruist begins to accuse others of selfish. The pious man condemns his neighbors. The woman who represses jealousy becomes obsessed with exposing betrayal in others. This stage is insidious because it cloaks the shadow in righteousness. The very qualities they most hate within themselves are declared to be the sins of others, and society, too eager to follow voices of certainty, often applauds. The third stage is inflation. Here, the individual begins to believe in their own mask. They are not merely good, they are chosen, special, pure. The ego expands beyond its natural limits, intoxicated with its image of virtue. This is the stage where leaders rise, preachers thunder, caregivers wear their exhaustion like a crown. The more inflated the mask, the more fragile it becomes, and the shadow, denied and humiliated, sharpens its teeth in secret. The fourth stage is eruption. It can arrive suddenly, a violent outburst, a betrayal, a crime, or it can manifest slowly, cruelty, manipulations, hidden abuse. But eruption always arrives because the psyche cannot hold the imbalance forever. The good parent becomes abusive, the trusted leader corrupt, the saint violent. What appears to others as a shocking transformation is, in truth, the inevitable end of possession. And finally, the fifth stage, collapse. Once the mask is shattered, the individual is left staring into the abyss of what they have become. Some break down completely, consumed by guilt and shame. Others double down, denying their fall and escalating cruelty to preserve their image. This is the most dangerous moment, for a possessed soul that refuses to awaken becomes capable of horrors unimaginable. Modern science echoes these stages. Psychologists at Stanford describe moral injury, the collapse of self-image when one's hidden shadow is exposed. Neuroscientists explain how repeated suppression creates neurological imbalances that mimic states of possession. But long before laboratory, ancient traditions warned of this pain. In Christianity, Judas embodies it: denial, projection of blame, inflation of self-righteousness, eruption in betrayal, and collapse in despair. In Hindu myth, the Asuras, demons born of pride, emerge from those who denied their darker instincts. In every culture, the pattern is told again and again because it is not cultural, it is archetypal. The signs of these stages can be read like omens: the silence too heavy to be honest, the smiles that feel trembling hands, the accusations that reveal more about the accuser than the accused, the intoxicating glow of self-image that leaves no room for flaw. Each is a scene of suspense, a warning that possession is tightening its grip. The danger multiplies when these stages occur collectively. A group in denial refuses to admit its flaws. It begins to project them onto outsiders, calling them corrupt, evil, dangerous. The group inflates, convinced of its purity and destiny. Then comes eruption, persecution, violence, war. Finally, collapse, ruins, regret, the long shadow of collective guilt. History is nothing more than humanity repeating these stages on a grand scale. To survive, one must recognize the pattern before the final act. You must not be seduced by denial, not fall prey to projection, not worship the intoxication of the mask. You must admit your darkness before it erupts. To retreat from groups that demand purity, to protect yourself from leaders who smile too brightly. The protocol is vigilance. The shield is consciousness. For the truth is this: possession is not a myth. It is a process unfolding in slow motion, in your neighbor, your family, yourself. And when it reaches eruption, it is too late to turn back. The only salvation lies in the courage to meet your shadow in the first stage before it seizes you completely. Because once the mask breaks, once the eruption begins, the saint is gone. And in their place stands something unrecognizable, something monstrous, something ancient, something that wears the face of the one you loved, but whose eyes no longer see you. There is a terror greater than the fall of one individual, the awakening of the shadow in the collective. When an entire society denies its darkness, repression grows into something vast, something inhuman. It does not erupt as a single violent act, but as movements, crusades, and wars. History is littered with corpses left behind, not by villains who knew they were cruel, but by crowds convinced they were good. The collective shadow is the most dangerous monster of all, for it wears the mask of virtue while devouring entire generations. I once stood in a square in Nuremberg, long after the echoes of speeches had faded. The stones were silent, but the air still felt heavy, as though the memory of millions lingered. Photographs from that place showed faces uplifted, eyes shining, hands raised in unison. They believed themselves righteous, chosen, pure, yet from that intoxication of virtue flowed the machinery. This was not the eruption of one mad possession, entire people. Jung himself warned of this danger, writing that when the shadow is denied collectively, it manifests as psychic epidemics. They are far more devastating than plagues of the body, for they infect the very soul of humanity. Modern psychology confirms this. Researchers studying group behavior speak of moral panic, where communities amplify fear and justify cruelty in the name of protection. Neuroscientists show how mirror neurons synchronize emotions across crowds, allowing rage, fear, or pride to spread like fire. In mass movements, the individual ceases to think, the collective shadow thinks for them. History calls these moments revolutions, purges, crusades, but in truth they are possessions, epidemics of the soul. Yet ancient wisdom already foresaw it. In the Hebrew scriptures, entire nations were punished not for their evil alone, but for their denial of it. In Greek tragedy, Oedipus's blindness becomes the blindness of Thebes itself. In Buddhist teachings, collective delusion is described as Maya, a veil that covers entire cultures, leading them to repeat cycles of violence. Even in Norse myth, Ragnarok is not the fall of one god or hero, but the collapse of the whole cosmos under the weight of denied shadow. The signs of collective possession appear in whispers before they scream. The leader who promises purity, the crowd that cheers with too much fervor, the silence that falls when questions. Families reflect it too. The household where no one speaks of anger, where smiles are demanded, where obedience is worshipped. These are microcosms of the same disease. The air grows heavier, the laughter emptier, the rituals more rigid. If you listen carefully, you can hear the shadow moving beneath the surface, sharpening its claws. The stages mirror the individual descent, but magnify. Denial, whole societies refusing to admit their greed, their cruelty, their envy. Projection, naming outsiders, minorities, or enemies as the embodiment of evil. Inflation, crowds intoxicated with visions of destiny, purity, or utopia. Eruption, pogroms, inquisitions, genocide, collapse, ruins, shame, history books drenched in regret. These cycles repeat like nightmares because humanity refuses its shadow while awake. But survival is possible, though rare. The shield remains the same. Consciousness. Individuals must refuse the intoxication of collective purity. They must draw boundaries, resist the crowd, retreat strategically when the shadow becomes a movement. Jung once wrote that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. This is not romantic idealism. It is the only hope. When enough people dare to see their own darkness, the collective epidemic can be weakened, perhaps even prevented. The truth, however, is grim. Most will not awaken. Most will choose the mask, the intoxication of purity, the thrill of belonging to a cause greater than themselves. They will march, chant, obey, and when the eruption arrives, they will insist they did not see it coming. But the shadow was always there, waiting, whispering, feeding on their denial. You must remember this: the crowd that cheers the loudest for goodness may be the first to become monstrous. The family that insists it is perfect may be the one where violence brews in silence. The nation that declares itself purest may be the one that burns the world. Do not trust the mask of collective virtue. Trust only the eyes that have looked into their own darkness and lived to speak of it. Because when the collective shadow awakens, it does not come it comes wearing the flag, the hymn, the prayer, smile of your neighbor. And by the time you recognize it, there is a poison more intoxicating than wine, more addictive than opium, more destructive than hatred. It is the poison of righteousness, the belief that one is good, pure, beyond reproach. Once a soul drinks from this chalice, it ceases to question. It no longer doubts, no longer reflects. And in that silence of self-examination, the shadow begins to whisper with unchallenged authority. What was once compassion becomes control. What was once love becomes domination. What was once care becomes violence justified by virtue. I once spoke with a man whose every word dripped with righteousness. He fed the poor, led charities, and stood at the pulpit on Sundays. His community adored him. Yet, in the quiet of my study, he confessed to dreams of strangling beggars who did not thank him, of punishing his wife for her doubts, of purging his congregation of those who questioned him. He was horrified. Yet, even as he trembled, he assured me, "But I know I am a good man." It was this conviction, more than the dreams, that terrified. For the man who doubts his goodness can be saved. The man who believes his goodness is absolute is already lost. Science has given this poison a name: moral superiority bias. Studies show that individuals who score highest on measures of self-perceived morality are often least able to recognize faults. Neuroimaging reveals diminished activity in the regions of the brain responsible for self-critique. They are, quite literally, blinded by their belief in their own light. This blindness becomes fertile ground for cruelty, because when they harm others, they do not call it violence, they call it justice. The ancients warned us in every tongue. In the Bible, the Pharisees are condemned not for obvious sin, but for their pride and purity. In Taoism, the Master teaches that those who boast of their virtue have already lost it. In Greek myth, Bellerophon, believing himself more righteous than mortals, tried to ascend to Olympus and was cast down in ruin. In Hindu texts, the Asuras claim moral superiority as they wage endless wars, convinced of their own holiness. Across cultures, the message repeats, righteousness without humility is the seed of monstrosity. The signs of seduction are chilling. The parent who insists, "I always do what is right," while crushing their child's spirit with impossible expectations. The politician who proclaims, "We are the good people," while preparing to silence dissent. The teacher who speaks of love but punishes curiosity as rebellion. These are not small flaws, they are symptoms of possession. They are the smiles of those who have already swallowed the poison. The stages of righteousness are seductive. First, intoxication, the warmth of admiration, the applause of peers, the glow of being seen as good. Second, blindness, the quiet dismissal of flaws, the refusal to admit envy, cruelty, or pride. Third, justification, violence disguised as morality, cruelty repackaged as necessity. Fourth, destruction, families shattered, communities silenced, lives ended in the name of purity. At each stage, the soul falls deeper into possession, believing all the while that it rises closer to the divine. When entire societies fall into righteousness, history weeps blood. The Spanish Inquisition burned bodies for the sake of saving souls. The French Revolution executed thousands in the name of liberty. The Cultural Revolution silenced generations in the name of purity. These were not crimes committed by monsters, but by men and women convinced of their virtue. The shadow wore robes of light, and the crowd applauded. Flames rose. The protocol of protection is simple, though brutal. Doubt your goodness. Question your purity. Refuse the intoxication of applause. When you feel yourself glowing with righteousness, ask yourself what shadow you are refusing to see. Consciousness is the antidote, humility the shield, self-critique the weapon. Without them, you will drink the poison and call it nectar. Here is the truth. Those who proclaim their own goodness are the ones you should fear most. Their smile hides a knife. Their kindness hides chains. Their voice of love hides a hunger to dominate. Righteousness seduces like a lover, whispering that you are chosen, pure, invincible. But when you finally awaken, you will find yourself not embraced by divinity, but shackled in the arms of your own shadow, transformed into something unrecognizable. Remember this, it is not evil disguised as evil that destroys civilization. It is evil disguised as virtue. And the more righteous a man declares himself to be, the more dangerous his shadow has already become. There are truths that are not meant to comfort, but to wound. And yet, it is only in being wounded that the soul awakens. To live among the dangerously good is to live in a minefield. Their smiles can be traps, their gifts can be chains, their words of love can be daggers dipped in honey. If you do not learn to recognize the signs, you will be caught in their descent, dragged down into the abyss of their shadow. There is no mercy in ignorance. Survival requires knowledge. Survival requires vigilance. The first protocol is consciousness. You must dare to see what others refuse. When a person seems too good, too selfless, too pure, you must look for the shadow they deny. Notice the subtle tremors, the smile that feels rehearsed, the silence that feels heavy, the resentment that leaks in the tone of their voice. To recognize these cracks is not paranoia. It is protection. For every mask of goodness hides a fissure, and those who see it first are the ones who live. The second protocol is boundaries as armor. Never let yourself be consumed by those who demand endless. When someone gives too much, expect that one day they will demand repayment with violence. When someone insists you owe them because of their goodness, step back. Draw the line without hesitation. Survival depends on the courage to say no, even when the crowd calls it cruelty. For to protect yourself is not sin, it is wisdom. The third protocol is strategic retreat. When the collective shadow awakens, when the crowd intoxicates itself with purity, you cannot fight it head-on. The one who resists openly will be crushed by the mob. You must retreat, protect your soul, preserve the spark of consciousness for a future where reason can breathe again. This is not cowardice. It is survival, the same way a forest withdraws its seeds underground during fire, waiting to rise again when the flames have passed. The fourth protocol is naming. Speak it aloud, not to condemn, but to strip it of its secrecy, to say, I see the anger and see the envy. I see the hatred. This act alone prevents possession, for what is named cannot fully control you. Silence gives the shadow power. Words, spoken in honesty, weaken its grip. To confess your capacity for darkness is to ensure it does not seize you in blindness. Science confirms the wisdom of these protocols. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches patients to confront intrusive thoughts directly, rather than repress them. Neuroscience shows that naming emotions reduces their intensity by regulating the amygdala. Modern trauma studies confirm that boundaries protect not only the psyche, but the very biology of survival. What ancient wisdom spoke of as spiritual warfare, psychology now records in data and scans. But the ancients never doubted. In Christian scripture, Paul speaks of the armor of God, truth, righteousness, faith, tools to protect the soul from unseen forces. In Buddhist practice, mindfulness itself is the shield, the constant awareness that dissolves illusion. In Greek philosophy, Socrates taught that the unexamined life is not worth living, a warning that to ignore the shadow is to invite destruction. These traditions converge in the same message. Without vigilance, the shadow, the signs that you must act are always. When kindness feels suffocating, when generosity feels like a debt, when purity feels like control, you must recognize the danger. These are not minor discomforts. They are alarms, signals that the mask of goodness is cracking. To ignore them is to walk willingly into the monster's embrace. The stages of survival mirror the stages of possession, but in reverse. Where possession begins with denial, survival begins with acknowledgement. Where possession grows with projection, survival grows with ownership. Where possession inflates the ego, survival deflates it with humility. Where possession erupts, survival retreats strategically. Where possession collapses into ruin, survival stands firm in awareness. It is not an easy path, but it is the only path. And so I tell you plainly, do not trust the endlessly good. Trust the one who admits their flaws, who speaks of their darkness, who trembles before their own capacity for cruelty. They are the safe ones, for they are awake, the ones who declare themselves pure, holy, perfect. These are the ones who will devour you when their shadow erupts. To survive in a world of monstrous goodness, you must keep your consciousness sharp as a blade, your boundaries firm as iron, your retreats as calculated, and above all you must face your own darkness before it faces you. For the monster you know is weaker than the monster you refuse to see. Remember, survival is not comfort, it is vigilance. And in a world intoxicated with masks of virtue, vigilance is the only form of freedom left. There is a mirror that few dare to look into. It does not show the polished image you offer the world. It does not reflect the smile, the kind gestures, the glowing reputation. This mirror shows only what you have denied, what you have buried, what you have sworn you are not. And when you stand before it, the reflection does not blink. It waits, silent, merciless. This is the shadow, the abyss at the center of the human soul. And it is here, in this final confrontation, that we must decide whether we will remain human or become monsters disguised as saints. Throughout history, people have feared demons, devils, spirits, and unseen forces. But Jung revealed a truth far more unsettling. The most dangerous monster is not outside us, it is within. The smile of the overly good neighbor, the gentle hand of the selfless parent, the flawless virtue of the moral leader. These are masks, and behind them, if unexamined, lives the shadow, silent, patient, inevitable. What society calls evil is not foreign intrusion. It is the child of denial, raised in the basement of the psyche until it grows too strong to be contained. Modern science now echoes this ancient terror. Neuropsychology shows that repressed emotions do not vanish, they transform the brain, altering behavior in ways unseen until eruption. Trauma research confirms that the unsaid, the unseen, the unacknowledged writes itself into the body, shaping destiny in silence. Collective psychology warns us that when entire groups deny their flaws, they project them outward, creating enemies to annihilate. What Jung foresaw as archetypes, science now measures with instruments and graphs. And yet, no instrument can soften the truth. The abyss is real, and it lives inside you. The ancients, too, whispered this warning. The Greeks spoke of hubris, the pride of believing oneself pure, untouchable, beyond flaw, as the surest path to ruin. The Christians told of Lucifer, once the brightest angel, whose perfection burned him into the image of evil. The Buddhists warned against clinging to sainthood, for attachment to purity is itself a form of blindness. In every culture, across every century, the same message is carved into myth and scripture. Ignore your shadow, and it will consume you. The signs are around you if you dare to see them. The friend who never admits anger but grows colder with every smile. The leader who proclaims purity while silencing dissent. The family that insists it is perfect but trembles under unspoken tension. Each is a warning, a crack in the mask, and if you refuse to notice, you will stand shocked when the eruption arrives, insisting, "I never saw it coming." But the truth is, you did see. You only refused to believe. The stages of the abyss are eternal. Denial births projection. Projection births inflation. Inflation births eruption. Eruption births collapse. And collapse births silence. The silence of regret, of horror, of corpses buried in the name of goodness. This cycle is the rhythm of history, the pulse of human tragedy, and it will repeat until enough individuals dare to stand before the mirror and endure what they see. What then is the final protocol? It is not escape. It is not purity. It is not denial. It is awareness. To hold your darkness in one hand and your light in the other, without lying about either. To admit, I am capable of cruelty. I am capable of envy. I am capable of violence. Sire, and in that admission, to strip the shadow of its power to control you in secret. Wholeness, not perfection, is the true salvation. Understand this. The world will always seduce you with images of the purely good, the flawlessly kind, the eternally virtuous. But these are the most dangerous illusions. The only people you can trust are those who have looked into their own abyss and returned alive, for they know what they are capable of, and in knowing, they are less likely to unleash it blindly. So let this echo remain with you. Goodness without shadow is a lie. Purity without flaw is a mask, and the one who denies their darkness is already halfway to becoming monstrous. If you wish to survive in this world of smiling saints and poisoned halos, you must look into your abyss before it looks into you. For in the end, there is no escaping the mirror. There is only the courage to face it, or the fate of being devoured by the reflection you refused to see.